Overwatch has towed the line between FPS and MOBA genres since its release in 2016, and many have argued whether it falls more closely into either camp to no real meaningful end. But what good are these kinds of comparisons if you can't use your MOBA knowledge to better understand how Overwatch is played? In this video, we're going to go over the systems and heroes in Overwatch and how they can be likened to those in League of Legends. So congratulations, now you can use those thousands of hours of ranked and that silver 2 peak of yours to learn something new. Let's start by going over the abilities and weapons in Overwatch. All characters in Overwatch will rely on both their weapons and their abilities, just like how in League, characters rely on both their auto attacks and their abilities. Weapons will have different kinds of mechanics in Overwatch that are worth knowing. There's hit scan type weapons, projectile type weapons, and there's headshots. So you can kind of think of hit scan type weapons as the closest comparison to auto attacks. These are going to be very consistent damage dealing weapons. Hit scan means that the moment you press primary fire on your weapon, you will instantly deal damage wherever your crosshair is. It literally scans to see what's in front of you and then hits it. Hit scan type weapons will typically have high fall off damage, meaning at longer ranges they'll do less. So keep that in mind while you're playing with these types of weapons. Projectile type weapons, unlike hit scan, will have a travel time between when you hit the fire button and when they hit their target, meaning you'll have to lead your shots. You can think of this kind of like hitting skill shots in League of Legends. Also, unlike hit scan shots, there's no damage fall off for projectiles in Overwatch, meaning they'll do the same amount of damage no matter how far away you are from your target. And of course, most weapons in the game, both hit scan and projectile, will deal headshot damage, which you can think about almost like crits in League of Legends. Worth noting though that not every type of attack can headshot, for example melee attacks or beam type weapons. There are some more unique weapons as well, for example Mei's primary fire will cause her to slow targets that she's damaging, but these are the main mechanics you should be thinking about. Outside of just weapon mechanics, there are of course a ton of ability mechanics tied to each hero that have pretty close comparisons to most mechanics in MOBAs. For example, there's mobility, self-sustain, crowd control, disruption, damage amplification, and so on. But many of these mechanics are either only available to a small subset of heroes or sometimes even unique to a single individual hero. So I'd recommend getting to know the heroes before thinking too much about unique mechanics. And since we brought up crowd control, it's worth mentioning that compared to League of Legends, there is not really that much crowd control in the game. You're not going to be stun locking and burning down your targets easily. And also worth noting that most, but not all of the crowd control in the game is going to be coming from the tank characters in Overwatch. All the abilities in Overwatch will be tied to cooldowns, just like in League of Legends, but there are no core resources like mana or energy. There are some heroes like D.Va and Moira who have their own unique resource for specific abilities, but the output of most heroes in the game are only going to be gated by your ammo count, those cooldowns we mentioned, and of course just the ability to hit your shots. And speaking about the ability to hit those shots, this is how damage is balanced in Overwatch and in most FPS games. It is not an easy task to hit every single one of your shots, so characters will be doing a significant amount of damage assuming your mechanics are on point. Learning how to shoot in an FPS is a very daunting task, and mixing that up with a high-paced environment that's also very movement-heavy in a game like Overwatch is a very uphill battle for many players. If this is your first time playing an FPS game, be patient with yourself. This is a new skill you're learning. It takes time. But if you are able to hit your shots, almost every single character in the game has a very high damage potential. Even the tankiest tanks or supports who focus more on utility than anything else will do a surprising amount of damage. This is again gated by the ability to hit those shots, but also by the high amount of healing in Overwatch. Healing is very much a core mechanic to Overwatch, so be sure to factor that in when considering the time to kill your targets. You can basically think of every support in Overwatch having Soraka levels of healing output. So that should give you an idea of what types of weapons are out there, the types of abilities you might expect from different heroes, but like I mentioned, you'll want to learn how each hero functions in order to understand their kits and what to expect in your games. Next thing I want to talk about is how information is presented in Overwatch. So there's obviously a very big difference to your point of view as a player in an FPS compared to a MOBA. First-person view is a much more limited form than a top-down view. You can only see what's directly in front of your character, and you'll need to be moving your camera around in order to see different areas of the map. There's no mini-map to help you here, and there's no camera movement outside of what's within your own range. In addition to that, you can't see anything from your teammates' LOS, so make sure you're using things like the ping system or communications to help work with your teammates whenever you can. You can think of targets that are outside of your line of sight, or your LOS, as basically the same as being in the fog of war in League of Legends. If you aren't sure where they are, you can of course predict them, but unless you have teammates pinging them out for you or you can see them yourself, you really don't know. Alright, now let's get to the meat of this video, comparing the heroes in Overwatch to the champions in League of Legends. Overwatch only really has simple classes to define their heroes. There's tanks, there's damage-based heroes, and there's supports. And these are good for understanding the overall expectations of those characters. For example, tanks will take more damage heroes will pump out more damage, of course, and supports have more healing and utility in their kits. But just like League of Legends, there's some important differences in playstyles across all of the cast members. So to do this, what we're going to do is break down the Riot-sanctioned champion classes in League of Legends and find their Overwatch equivalents. I know this isn't how most people think about League of Legends characters, but I think it's a good metric to measure characters against and then compare to in a different game. So, the champion classes in League of Legends. There are enchanters and catchers under the controller class. There's juggernauts and divers under the fighter class. There's burst battle mages and artillery mages under the mage class. There's the marksman class all on its own. There's assassins and skirmishers under the slayer class. And there's vanguards and wardens under the tank class. We can eliminate some of these subclasses from the comparison that don't really have equivalents in Overwatch. For example, catchers don't really exist outside of a single hero called Roadhog, who has a hook similar to Blitzcrank. And burst mages aren't really a valid title for characters in Overwatch because, like I mentioned, almost all the characters have some form of burst damage that are gated by mechanics. Finally, we can start combining some of the remaining subclasses to better label heroes in Overwatch, but some of these can be left on their own. So let's go through the remaining list. Marksmen exist in Overwatch in a very similar role, but I'm going to be calling them anchors for this video. Anchors will focus on that sustained influence over a team fight from range while skirting on the edge of the battlefield. Assassins will function very similarly in Overwatch like they do in League, and we're going to keep the name because it's very fitting. They have high damage output as well as high mobility to close the distances and dispatch high priority heroes in close range. Next we have artillery mages, which are a bit weird to say, but I'm going to be comparing these with snipers in Overwatch because of their use of incredible range to threaten their targets from across the battlefield, and of course by the fact that they'll often be punished in the short range. We're going to combine battle mages and skirmishers, and we're going to just label them as brawlers for this video. These are the heroes that rely on close quarters combat and use cooldowns to extend their ability to stay in a fight. Next, we're going to combine juggernauts and wardens, and I thought the name juggernauts was really fitting, so we're going to keep that title. And these are going to be the heroes that are able to take heavy hits, but also dish out a heavy amount of damage in the close range. Next, we're putting together divers and vanguards, and we're going to be labeling them as initiators for Overwatch. These are going to be the characters that use high mobility to start fights in their favor, not just by finding kills, but by putting pressure on high priority targets. And finally, we're going to take the enchanters subclass and we're going to relabel it enablers. And these are going to be the characters that focus on amplifying the playmaking ability of those around them with either defensive or offensive pressure. You'll notice that there are tanks, DPS, and supports sometimes all in the same label. Of course, supports in the anchor class won't be doing as much damage as DPS in that class, but this is to help understand the general playstyle of these heroes. A hero like Ana would like to stay in the same types of ranges and positions as a hero like Ashe, even though one is focused on healing and one is focused on damage most of the time. So, this list here should give you a general idea of what types of heroes you could try out in Overwatch that might match your playstyle to champions in League. But keep in mind, this is very far from an exhaustive guide for these heroes. Just like in League, most of these heroes can be played effectively in a variety of different ways. These comparisons are here just to give you a general idea of where to get started when trying to find heroes that you might enjoy playing. If you're looking for more information about some of these heroes, you can check out the guides on my channel where I dive more in-depth into these roles and individual heroes. Now that we've broken down how some of the heroes in Overwatch play and how you can find characters that suit your playstyle, let's talk about how a match of Overwatch plays out. Compared to League of Legends, you can think of a match of Overwatch as just a series of team fights. There's no laning, there's no early or late game, there's no side objectives to worry about, and there's not really many opportunities for individual playmaking compared to League. For all those reasons, you can kind of think of Overwatch maps as closer to an ARAM rather than a standard game of Summoner's Rift. It's worth noting there are many different maps and map types in Overwatch that all center around different types of objectives, but teamfights should almost always be prioritized before those objectives. Think of this like needing to win a clean fight before attempting a Baron play, or to push for towers or inhibitors. In the same vein though, you can also think of this like using objective pressure, like pushing a payload to completion, in order to force an enemy to take a teamfight they may not be ready for, like forcing a Baron play when the enemy has no vision or when you're hitting a power spike. When preparing for a team fight, keep the following things in mind. Understand your role within the team. Like we mentioned in the heroes section of this video, there's different archetypes and every hero should have some idea of how their playstyle can contribute the best to a team fight. After that, think about your ideal position to start the team fight. Consider the location of the objective, the sight lanes you'll have access to, any available high grounds, and any available choke points that you can abuse. These are all strong focal points for determining your position. And finally, think about the cooldowns and potential ultimates available to both you and the enemy team. How are you going to use them? How are your teammates going to use theirs? And what's the enemy going to do with theirs? I'm sure you're already thinking about things like this when playing League of Legends. This is how you outplay your opponents, by being ready for their abilities. And as I mentioned, since Overwatch is played as a series of team fights, and there's no need to worry about going back and shopping for items, make sure that you're snowballing any advantage you get whenever you can. If you win a team fight, start planning for the next one right away. And the final thing I wanted to talk about in this video is economy. Now, like I mentioned, there's no real MOBA-like economy. There's no gold or items that we're talking about. For that reason, you can think about every hero starting the game at full build, but you can instead start thinking about ultimates as the in-game economy for Overwatch. If you didn't know, ultimates aren't just on a cooldown for Overwatch. They are charged by either doing damage or healing. So the more numbers you're putting out, the faster your ultimates will charge. Consider the availability of your ultimates similar to hitting an item power spike in League. You can use ultimate economy as a reason to take early team fights with an advantage if you've got more ults than the enemy, or it could be advantageous to wait for ult charge if you're close to getting it before rushing into your next team fight. Conversely, you can also think about taking an earlier fight before the enemy has ultimates charge as catching them before they've been able to back for an item spike. Ultimate economy in Overwatch is always going to be shifting and can be very difficult to read. A good general rule of thumb is to expect enemies to build their ultimates roughly every 2 team fights. To start building your ult tracking skills, you should try to predict when your enemy counterparts will have ultimates available based on how their charge relates to yours. So for example, if you're playing a tank and you see that you got your ultimate charged, the enemy tank is probably getting close to theirs if they don't already have it. So those are all the main points that I believe will help any of you MOBA players wrap your heads around Overwatch. Hopefully this guide gives you an idea of what kinds of heroes you might want to try out, or how to think about approaching different playstyles while in-game. If you'd like to learn about the game more in depth, you can check out some of the guides I've done on this channel, or come ask me questions in my Twitch stream or in my Discord community. Links to those in the description. And finally, I'd like to thank Questline Esports for helping me produce this video. Go check out their channel where we're producing even more Overwatch content. Once again, link in the description. But that's all from me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you out there on the battlefield.